Op een eerste of op een tweede niveau heb je dan eigenlijk oplossingen die gebruikt worden, open source oplossingen zoals KeePass. Hierin worden paswoorden bijgehouden en eventueel om de x aantal maanden manueel gewijzigd. Ook in het tweede maturiteitsniveau kan men gaan zeggen dat we niet meer met shared accounts gaan werken, maar dat hiervoor eigen accounts gebruikt worden. Op een derde niveau gaan we kijken naar MFA op de belangrijkste accounts. Gaat men wachtwoorden in een kluis steken waarvan sommige dan automatisch geroteerd gaan worden. Dit is waar PAM-oplossingen worden aangesproken. En op een hoogst maturiteitsniveau gaat men zorgen dat men MFA heeft op alle privileged accounts. Heeft men alle wachtwoorden daarnaast nog eens in rotatie. En gaat men voor service accounts aan virtual fencing doen, zodat deze ondanks hun verhoogde rechten alsnog enkel toegang krijgen tot wat ze effectief nodig hebben. Nu, zoals gezegd, om op dat derde niveau te geraken, gaan we naar een PAM-oplossing kijken. Een PAM-oplossing brengt vaak enkele uitdagingen met zich mee. Zo zijn veel PAM-projecten tijdrovend en complex en gaat men vaak enkel de meest kritieke delen gaan beveiligen. Dit komt door middel van de architectuur van een PAM-oplossing en dat het heel moeilijk is om de juiste architectuur te implementeren op het gehele netwerk. Ook is men afhankelijk van de compatibiliteit van de PAM-oplossing met toepassingen, iets wat bijvoorbeeld bij PowerShell niet beschikbaar is bij veel van de PAM-oplossingen. En omwille van exact dit scenario zien we alsnog meerdere hacks bij grote bedrijven die PAM-oplossingen in gebruik hebben. Ik denk dat je daar onder andere onlangs bij Uber nog een voorbeeld van gezien hebt. Dat gezegd zijn, dat is een beetje de uitdaging waar veel bedrijven voor staan en waar veel bedrijven moeilijkheden mee hebben vandaag de dag bij privileged accounts. Hoe wij dit oplossen, laat ik graag aan Jérôme om verder uit te leggen. Jérôme, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. So let me just share my screen here. There we go. All right, so I'm afraid this part is going to be in English because your English is way better than my Dutch. So yeah, let's just look very quick into how this thing works, how Silverfort allows you to protect from lateral movement, from ransomware and anything that privileged accounts can be misused for. So in the top left, we will see these privileged accounts, so that's your admins, your power users, anybody who has more privileges than your normal accounts. On the top right, we have the resources, that's anything that you've got on-prem or in the cloud for that matter. So this could be, file servers, web servers, your SQL databases, whatever is needed for your operations. And what's important to understand is that when such an account wants to get access to that resource, there's always going to be an authentication request sent to your IDP, so to the Active Directory, whether that's in Okta Ping or Microsoft. That authentication request will be sent every single time, not just when I log in the morning. Now what happens then is Silverfort has a small component sitting on the Active Directory, allowing to see that authentication request come in, no matter what protocol it is, no matter what application it comes from, no matter where in the environment it's being initiated from. And we can hold that authentication request and apply our policy. And that policy can then say, well, this is Jérôme and it's segregated admin account, so he needs to prove that he is who he claims to be. So we're going to send that to the MFA that's in place and wait for that answer. And while we're waiting, this authentication request is being held. It's not being forwarded to the resource. So we can send this authentication then to Microsoft MFA, Okta, RSA, Duo. You can see the list here. So it doesn't have to be a Silverfort MFA. It can be any of the ones that we integrate with. It can be FIDO2. If we're in an air-gapped environment, it can be something that's on-prem that doesn't need any cloud connectivity. And then we wait for the answer from the MFA, and then we release the ticket or we just deny access. All of that happens in real time. And the nice thing about that is that I don't need to install anything on the endpoints or on the servers, and I don't need a proxy. So this is a very lightweight implementation, which is very important. And also the privileged accounts or the users behind those privileged accounts, they're already used to Microsoft MFA. They know that from their Office 365 login, for example, or from whatever web application that's already protected with it. So there's nothing new to them. There's no onboarding, there's no enrollment. So with that, let's quickly look at some of those advantages. So as I said, no agents, no proxies, which makes the implementation happen in a couple of days instead of months or even longer if we look at other solutions that require these things. And also with that, before I go into the UX, what's important is that this is application agnostic. So we don't care about the protocol that is being used. We just look at the authentication itself. That's where we sit. That's what we see, and that's what we can enforce. So no matter what protocol is being used, we will see the authentication. So again, for the end user, there's no change. If he's been using Okta in the past, he's just going to use Okta now also for any privileged access inside the environment. So that's a very seamless transition into using what he's been using already for even more resources. And then obviously, since we see all of those authentications come in from privileged accounts, non-privileged accounts, and also service accounts, so the non-privileged accounts we've already covered in our first webinar, and for the service accounts we are going to cover in the third webinar, but also for the privileged accounts, we will see all those authentications come in, and we can apply some intelligence to that. So next to just enforcing MFA or blocking those accesses, we can apply roughly 45 different risk indicators, and then we'll show that a little bit further detail in the demo. And then out of those risk indicators, we can then provide a risk scoring in real time for those privileged accounts. So we will see whether the privileged account was under attack, for example, whether there was a lateral movement that happened in the environment automatically just by looking at the authentications, and we can react to that automatically. And I will go into that a little bit further in the demo. Again, we spoke about the fast implementation time already. So as opposed to a PAM solution, which is a valid solution for the environment, but if you need some quick wins, or if your customers need quick wins and need to cope, for example, with cyber insurance requirements, we can cover that in a very, very fast way. Again, talking about days of implementation and then just a little bit of configuration, and you're done. You have covered the privileged accounts, which is something that we are starting to see as a common requirement of cyber insurance as well, that just says, well, what are you doing, dear customer, to protect your privileged accounts? And interestingly enough, in those cyber insurance requirements, it doesn't talk about how those privileged accounts need to be protected or how they need to ensure protection in terms of lateral movement. Obviously, the cyber insurers don't really care about what protocol is being used or what applications those privileged accounts are using to do lateral movement, what tools, what admin interfaces. They don't care about that. They just want those accounts to be protected. And so if you just look at your authentication, again, Silverfort doesn't care about the application, the specific admin interface in use. We just protect the identity, which is quite important here. Yeah, again, so we can do adaptive protection in terms of the risk-based policy that I will show in a couple of minutes. So that allows us to say, well, in general, that account, for example, if it does a movement from A to B using PSXEC or whatever it is, wouldn't have to do an MFA, but since we have seen a brute force attack on that identity overnight, now the risk is elevated, and now we need that account to prove that the person behind it is actually who he or she claims to be. And what's very important in that environment is that solutions that have been on the market for a while have always required either plugins or scripting or actual change of applications in order to work. They were relying on endpoints. They were relying on little tools that had to be put on servers. All of that goes away with Silverfort. There's nothing to be developed. There's nothing that has to be changed in the infrastructure. We're completely transparent to the infrastructure, and actually the account or the identity that uses us doesn't even know we exist. So how does that work together with the classic solutions? How does that work with the PAMs of this world? Well, there's actually two things. So one is that we can be an accelerator. So we can help make that security policy of your customers be implemented a lot faster. So where a PAM is always a project that requires a lot of time, that's a long-term deployment, which is also, it's a solution that's needed, but to get quick wins and cope with, for example, a cyber insurance requirement where you don't have that much time for, Silverfort is an excellent extension to the PAM or an excellent accelerator to the PAM. And also, there needs to be protection for the keys to the kingdom. In a PAM solution, you will have somewhere a vault that contains all of the passwords, that contains all of the account information that's being rotated, but that needs protection as well. So for some of our customers, what we actually do is we put MFA on the PAM server itself, giving them the peace of mind that now the PAM instance is also protected from all angles, from lateral, not just the front end, but also the lateral movements that use PSXEC or PowerShell, and that could potentially go into that PAM server. And then from an extension perspective, there's, with PAM you can cover a lot of things, but unfortunately not everything. Just like the command line tools, for example, that's a very hard thing because they don't rely on protocols that can be protected using a proxy in the middle, and that's where we can really help as well. And then also, the Silverfort protection works in a complete air-gapped environment. So if you have those OT or IoT elements in those in some of your customers' environments, that's where we can help as well without having any internet connectivity. So with that, I would jump over and start with showing you how this works from an end user perspective. So on the top left, I have my standard workstation here, and I'm connected to that workstation. I'm logged in with an admin account with high privileges. And just for the sake of this example, on the top right, I have my cell phone. So that's actually a live view of my cell phone here, which has the Silverfort MFA app installed, as well as the Microsoft Authenticator, which asks me to show my fingerprint to get started with. So, and obviously in the back end, we have Silverfort deployment, which has a bunch of rules for privileged accounts. And the first thing I'd like to show is a very simple one. Somewhere we have here a PAM solution that I would like to RDP into. So I'm not using the front door of CyberArk, but as an admin, I'd like to RDP into that solution. So when I try to do that, so using my Silverfort app in this case, I will have to MFA that. So this is how, with a privileged account, I can actually protect command line tools or RDP or whatever it might be to get into the PAM solution here. The other thing that I'd like to show is, what I've spoke about earlier, is actually lateral movement. So admin accounts need those admin interfaces, obviously. They need to be able to do remote PowerShells, to be able to do PSXX and all those fancy command line tools that help them make their lives easy. Unfortunately, the same principles are being used for lateral movement for an attacker or for a ransomware to spread. So here's how we protect those as well. It's the exact same principle. And the example that I've done here is I'm just doing a PSXX, which means that I'm going from my machine here, which is RD16.1, and I'm trying to open a command line to RD16.2, which is a workstation that sits in the same environment. This is something an admin would use from his workstation to open up a command line on another workstation. But again, it's also something that a script would use in order to figure out what exists in the network, in order to spread its payload, to start encrypting disks and all those fancy things that we've seen in the past. So when I do that, I'm having the same effect here. So I'm using the Silverfort app again here. I could have used the Microsoft Authenticator for this. And just for the exercise here, I'm going to say no. This is not me, so I'm not going to allow that. And as you can see here, this has been denied. And I am still on RD16.1. The lateral movement was denied by Silverfort. Now, the nice thing about that is that this workstation doesn't have any Silverfort component on it. I don't need anything. So Silverfort acts where the authentication happens on the DC, on the Active Directory. We don't need anything on the workstation itself. We don't need anything on servers. So that's really very, very straightforward. The next thing that I'd like to show here is how this works from a management console perspective. We've seen a little bit of that in the first webinar, where we looked at some components of the management console. Let's just go over the main dashboard here, but then also actually look at how do I create a policy that would cover privileged access. So our dashboard simply shows live authentications. This is really what's happening in the environment right now. These are the authentications that are happening. We can see all the sources, we can see the destinations that these authentications go to. But more importantly, when we're doing that, when we're seeing all those authentications, as I said earlier, we are creating that risk scoring out of those 45 different risk indicators. So here's a quick overview of that. And actually, this is going to show you where are my admin accounts, where are my privileged users, and who's a shadow admin. That effect where people get more and more privileges over time and at some point end up with admin privileges without anybody knowing that they're actually at that level. So our platform will uncover those automatically without you having to do anything about that. And then at the same time, we are going to look at every single authentication and then provide that risk scoring. As an example here, we have this SF super admin, which is right now at critical risk. So this is a privileged account that has a suspected brute force attack, which is something you want to double check and really look at and send MFAs when the legitimate user that sits behind that account connects. And we can see that here on the top right-hand side. We can see that peak here in this authentication behavior. This is actually how this account has authenticated over time. And we see that massive peak here, a lot of authentication attempts in a very small amount of time. So this is why that risk indicator was bubbled up. and the account is now at critical risk. The nice thing is that from there we can create policy. We can create policy that says only when an account is at high risk or critical risk, then we need to push out an MFA to that account. Now, before I go into the policy, just very quickly, overall, this is an example of a overall threat detection or identity threat detection screen that we also provide, which actually shows the entire state of the organization, not only for the privileged accounts, but also for those accounts, obviously. And you can see all the risk indicators down here that you can look at. For example, suspected brute force. How many did I have those over time, and how has that changed? There's also a little incident management here, but actually most of our customers use their own SIEM and their own SOC, so that we will provide, obviously, all of our logging capabilities into that SIEM in real time. So last but not least, let's go into how do I create a policy for a privileged account. And I'm looking at the example that I've just made for the PAM solution here. So this is very, very straightforward. And actually, we suggest policy for all of the authentications from our logs, so that users don't really have to figure out what is the policy that I need. We suggest rules by authentication that we see. But let's just go into this really quick. So I have a policy here that's around accessing the vault. And obviously, you wouldn't put this on a single user. You would put this on a group or an OU where you actually keep your admin accounts or your privilege accounts. For the sake of the example here, I've used just my user account, but this could be, or this usually is, a group with all of the privilege accounts. You would specify the source where that account could come from, and that can be anything. In my case, I've chosen a certain machine where that has to be coming from, but it could be just empty, so that from any source that this group of people connect to my PAM solution, an MFA would be enforced. And I can go as deep as specifying how that connection has to take place for the MFA, or for the rule activity to be activated. So in my case, I'm just using until end here, but I could say, you know, however this connection is being done, and this is service principal names, by the way, it doesn't really matter how I want to connect to this box. It always has to be MFA, because this is where the keys to the kingdoms are stored. And then I would just specify what are my tokens that I would accept for this rule. And in my case, I've chosen Silverfort and Microsoft Authenticator, but I could have chosen pretty much anything here: FIDO2, Okta, Duo, RSA, you name it. So that's concluding the demonstration of the platform. I hope this was useful for you. So I would go back to Jasper, and I'd like to ask you, have there been any questions to this?
Question was, could you maybe expand a bit on the infrastructure that is needed for Silverfort itself?
Oh, yeah, okay, so our internal architecture. So as I said, we have that. Let me go back to that slide real quick and play this out. So we have that one component here that sits on the domain controller. That's a small service sitting on the domain controller, which actually doesn't do much. All it does, it takes in all of the authentication requests and it forwards it to the Silverfort architecture, which is usually composed of two components, two VMwares that can be deployed on-premise, that can also be deployed in the cloud. Most of the time, it's on-premise with the customers. So, and these two components are the admin console that you've just seen, that I've shown you. And the second one is what we call the node, which actually contains the logic that forwards that request to the MFA token in place, and then also applies the policy and gives the answer back to that small service. So it's 2 VMs, which can be VMware or Hyper-V, depending on what customers have in their environment, and that small service that sits on the domain controller, which also can be deployed in an unattended way. We have customers with over 250 domain controllers, so that service is deployed unattended. Any other questions?
Nope, that was it. Unless
All right.
somebody still wants to ask a follow-up question on this, so we'll leave it for a couple more seconds. But for now, that is it.
Okay.
I'll just say 6 december. Even in het Nederlands verder doen. 6 december hebben we ons laatste webinar, die gaat dieper in op het stukje service accounts en wat we doen rond service accounts beveiliging. We hopen jullie dan allemaal terug te zien ook natuurlijk. Ondertussen, als er nog vragen zijn, je kan ons bereiken via de e-mailadressen die op het scherm staan. Dus ja, er komt geen vervolgvraag binnen. So, Jerome, I think we are ready. I'll leave it to Killian to close off the webinar.
Alright. Zoals Jasper al zei, heel erg bedankt voor het luisteren. En we hopen jullie allemaal snel weer te zien bij de derde webinar. Voor nu een heel fijne dag en tot snel weer.